and welcome to the Vanguard podcast. Thanks so much for joining us, Spike.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, for listeners who aren't familiar, we've actually just been joined by Spike Cohen, who's the vice presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party presidential ticket. Spike, could you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Gavin, hi, everyone. My name is Spike Cohen. I am the Libertarian Party's candidate for vice president, along with my running mate, Jo Jorgensen, who's running for president. We are running on a platform of setting America free and taking the power back from the Republicrats and their bureaucrats and cronies and putting that power back in the hands of you, the American people, where it always belonged, so that you can live freer, happier, and safer lives. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with the two of you.
Yeah, we're really excited to talk to you today.
So the term libertarian means a lot of different things depending where in the world you go. You have, social libertarianism in Europe, anarcho-syndicalism movements in America, communism, whereas you also have the right-leaning libertarianism, which leans more towards anarcho-capitalism. Could you just, and you've described yourself as an anarchist, could you just give people an idea of your politics and what the libertarianism means to you?
So there's a couple questions there. One is my personal ethos and philosophy as it relates to libertarianism and then again, what libertarianism is generally. I think I'd like to answer that second question first.
Sure thing.
The elevator pitch that I give on libertarianism is pretty simple. We believe that each of us own our lives. And because we own our lives and ourselves, that means that we own our bodies. And since we own our bodies, that means that we own our labor. And since we own our labor, that means we own the product of our labor, which is our property. And we believe that whenever anyone tries to take from someone else's life or body or labor or property, it's an act of aggression. And we believe that's wrong, not just from a moral standpoint that you shouldn't, the old phrase, don't harm people and don't take their stuff. Not only is it wrong from a moral standpoint, but it's wrong from a utilitarian standpoint. It doesn't work. If I can take from the two of you and anyone else that's watching or listening to this at any time that I want, I'm not going to be a good steward of what I have. I'm not going to make good choices with what I have because I can just take more whenever I want to. And the rest of y'all aren't necessarily going to be good stewards of what you have because I can come and take it from you at any time. And if you look at the bad, centrally planned policies of the Republicans and Democrats, they're really just a situation in which they have presumed the authority and the right to take from us whenever they see fit. And it's not surprising that we get the harmful and abusive and inequitable outcomes that come from such an arrangement. When it comes to my personal ethos, I am an anarchist, although I need to be clear that neither Joe nor I are running on a platform of anarchy or ending the government. We are running on a platform of ending the wars, bringing the troops home, and keeping whatever military is sufficient to protect us against invasion, but not to have this empire around the world that's causing harm both here and abroad. Ending the war on drugs and freeing its victims from prisons, getting government out of healthcare and education so that costs can go down and access to truly affordable care and education can go up. And things like that. So we're not running on a platform of anarchy, but my personal ethos is definitely leaning more towards anarcho-capitalism, but with the idea that once you remove the coercion of the state, now we're just talking about preferences. See, when you're talking about statist capitalism versus statist communism, now you have a battle because they're fighting over who gets to impose what on the other under the threat of law. Whereas now, if you're talking anarcho-capitalism, anarcho-communism, anarcho-mutualism, syndicalism, whatever, you're just talking about how people want to voluntarily organize their societies, not what they want to force anyone else to do. I wouldn't be foolish enough to think that if I could just snap my fingers and make government go away, that all 7.5 billion people on this planet would organize their societies exactly the way that I would want them to. That's foolish. I think ultimately people are going to voluntarily choose to associate as they wish. So I'm more of a panarchist, I guess, than more so than saying this is the only way. I think that's foolish to think all of humanity is going to just do things this way.
Well, we totally agree on paper for sure. And I just want to flesh out a few of these areas of maybe slight disagreement we have. So we talk about like the military industrial complex, these various institutions, which we would probably agree are not, in the best interest of the American people, and that are examples of big bloated government. The MIC obviously is a big example, the healthcare industry, these kind of things. But how do you square the fact that these institutions are, rapacious capitalist institutions? How can we really truly be free in a government, in a country which allows these institutions to be so out of hand, to be so rapacious, to allow them to be bigger and have more rights than your average citizen? It seems like in the libertarian ideology, these kind of institutions are just allowed to, continue unfettered.
Our government doesn't allow it. They mandate it. See, that's the difference here. In a market and a people set free, we would no sooner allow ourselves to be boxed into the kind of corners that government boxes us in. So for a perfect example, with healthcare, let's start with that. I think we all agree that our healthcare system is a mess. Our government is spending something like, it's actually spending more money per patient than most other countries on earth. And then we're paying out of pocket in addition to that. We're paying something like 3 times the developed nation average. And our outcomes are generally better than the developed nation average, but not enough for it to be worth. We're not getting 3 times the service, put it that way. You have situations where venture capital companies are going in, buying pharmaceutical companies, gutting the research and development. They're not making new drugs. They're simply squatting on the patents so that on drugs like insulin and epinephrine, things that have been around decades or sometimes over a century, things that have been around longer than almost all of us have been alive, and they're jacking up the prices 100-fold, 1,000-fold because the government mandated insurance companies have to pay it. Why do they have to pay it? Because of patent protections. If the government wasn't going in and picking this winner over all the other losers and saying, yeah, no, this person, this entity is the only one that's allowed to make this 100-year-old drug that costs pennies to make, they wouldn't be able to charge that much because it can be made by anyone. We see a similar thing with certificate of need laws. If you want to make a new hospital or you want to make a new medical center or an MRI or anything else in an area, you have to beg and scrape the local municipality to get permission to do it. Those cities and municipalities don't want to have to do that. It's the federal law, and it's specifically designed to keep out new supply of healthcare. Well, I think we can all agree if demand is going up for something and supply is repressed, that's going to lead to higher cost overruns. It's going to cause the cost to go up because demand is outstripping supply. If you're a doctor who wants to charge some of your patients less or even charge nothing to some of your patients because they can't afford to pay, that's against federal law. You cannot do that. If you look at there have been studies that have shown that 75% of the cost of healthcare is nothing but compliance with regulations and red tape and bureaucracy and taxes from Medicare, Medicaid, and government mandated insurance. Keep in mind, I'm not talking about the actual subsidization of people that need care. I'm talking about the red tape and regulations that they impose on the providers that drive up the cost of the care. And that cost overrun and the man hours required to comply is causing more and more doctors to give up their own practices and join these monolithic, monstrous health management companies, which is, again, benefiting the very well-heeled, politically connected cronies who have bought and paid for the Republicans and Democrats that they prefer in office, so that they can pass these kind of regulations to retain their market share at the expense of literally every other person in this country, including all 3 of us. The answer to that is not to trust that same entity with deciding whether or not we even get healthcare. Anyone who thinks that the government should be deciding whether or not we get healthcare, I submit to you the Veterans Administration. Because
actually push back on that a little bit. I want to ask you, you said, the United States is at its, supposedly a democracy, right? So let's adopt and say that we are going to, continue the ethic of democracy. If we allow the quote unquote government, which is supposedly for and by the people, to operate for and by the people,
do you
then
believe
people
that?
will. I believe that they can, yes. And I do believe that if we effectively organize together in a system, and you've mentioned anarchism, a system where people are free to choose and assemble and make the rulings that they'd like. If they did, form a system that's together, we can agree that they wouldn't form ours. But I do think that they could come to the conclusion that healthcare is a right, something like public schooling, something that we like roads, something that has enough public good, because in a time like a pandemic, if I don't have healthcare and you don't have healthcare, we don't have the ability to effectively mitigate it. Do you think there's any merit to that?
No, not at all. I think, well, let me rephrase that. There is merit to the idea that we have a right to be able to get the care that we need. What we disagree on isn't on whether or not we should be able to get it. Where we disagree on is the actual mechanism by which that happens. And I would submit to you that any organization that is a violent monopoly, that is founded on that finding forced by threats of harm to whatever level is needed to be able to bring everyone into compliance, we can't expect to get good service from that. Because that is at its core what it is. When we talk about democracy is simply the mechanism by which we choose who gets put in those positions of power. But that's not the actual power itself. By actually relegating and abdicating our power and allowing our power to be taken by these centralized authorities, we are asking them to have total control of our lives. There is no one who is good enough to have total control over people's lives and make good choices over and over and over again reliably, and then be able to be trusted to pass it on to someone else who does the same in perpetuity. And again, I point at our history. Our history, U.S. government history, there were not uniquely evil people that were in charge of our government. And yet look at the outcomes that have happened. Look at the harmful and inequitable outcomes. Look at how it has gotten worse over time in terms of things like income inequality and generational poverty. The reality that used to be in previous generations, that each generation did slightly better than the other, is no longer the case. Millennials are expected to do not as well as Gen X, and Gen Z is expected not to do as well as millennials. We are now seeing economic downward turns, and it is happening as a result of a bloated and wasteful government that is not just bloated and inefficient, but at its very core is a monopoly on the ability to make decisions, is taking power from people and is handing those power off to the corporations who put them in place.
I agree that it's definitely bloated and that it's definitely not working, but I would say that the reason it's so bloated and the reason it's not working is because not enough of that money, those funds are going to the people. They're going to the top, the corporations, these health insurance companies, and the very privatized institutions, which are kind of ripping people off in record numbers right now.
They're also coming from the people. The money is coming from it. It is every
agreed.
Government program is wealth redistribution from those who have the least to those who have the most, by the very nature of taxation being regressive.
Spike, would you support a privatization of the fire department or of something like that the police department?
I would support individual communities being able to decide what their first response looks like, and if they want to have competing options, then they have a right to do that. If they want to have one option, but they're the ones deciding what it looks like, then I think that's fine as well. But that's not what we have. We have state-imposed first response, and the firefighters aren't the ones I'm worried about. It's the police.
I think that's actually.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's actually a point of agreement that we might have. I would actually be interested in hearing your perspective on the defund the police movement. As a libertarian, somebody who is suspicious and stands against large government, how do you feel about the movement to defund the police?
Absolutely. So Jo Jorgensen's plan is to basically federally defund the police. The police should have never been a federal issue. And what has happened is now that it is a federal issue, the federal government has used the police as a militarized enforcement mechanism for the war on drugs and the war on terror. These are both things that need to end anyway. But in addition to that, we need to end civil asset forfeiture. We need to end no-knock raids. We need to end the mandatory minimum sentencing. We need to end the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine ends when the war on drugs ends, which we would end the war on drugs, we would end the war on guns, we would end the war on income. All of these things are situations and institutions in which the federal government has weaponized the police, the people whose job was supposed to be to protect our lives and our rights and our safety and our property, instead is using them as an enforcement mechanism for a bunch of federal priorities in order to be able to impose themselves on the people. And as a result, the states have restructured themselves to operate as chattel slave contractors, to be able to make sure that they have enough people in prison to hand off to for-profit prison labor contractors who are making
should not be for profit.
What's that?
So prison should not be for profit. You think they should be government run then?
Well, I'm talking about the contractors that actually contract prison labor. So you actually have chattel slavery contractors that are so profitable that they're actually listed on the stock market.
That's why.
Going to the question of private versus for-profit prisons, the ideal was that it was supposed to be more efficient, that because they're for-profit, and my understanding is that they actually are more efficient per prisoner, but the problem is you've now also created yet another private, and they're not private. If your only client is the government, you're not private, but a private lobbying firm who is now saying, yeah, we need more laws to keep the people safe. Oh, and it also happens to put more people in our prisons and give us more money. But we're totally just pushing it because we want people to be safe. So,
that's kind of what I was arguing with the healthcare insurance. It's like when you introduce that profit motive, it kind of like when you get to something like policing or prison or healthcare, like how do you square that?
So the problem with prison isn't the profit motive. The profit motive is what drives it further. The problem is the concept of imprisoning people who aren't a threat to anyone in the first place.
Agreed, but the reason they're being imprisoned is because of a profit motive. They wouldn't be
the reason they're initially being imprisoned is because of bad government policy that was designed to criminalize being
and to help corporations like the private prisons.
That is what has happened as a result of that. But when you're going to healthcare, now you're talking about an actual service that is necessary. And locking up, 1 out of every 10 people in this country is something that's necessary. That's not something that we need or want or desire.
Oh, I totally agree with that. 100%.
So when we're talking about healthcare, It is the profit motive that actually, absent the state and its protections for major corporations, it's actually the profit motive that would keep costs at an equilibrium. If I'm a doctor and the only way I can get paid is by you paying me, I can't jack the price up too much because I'm going to start losing patients. If I jack it up to a point where people can't afford it, I'm not going to be able to have many patients. And so in order to be able to serve people and have enough people actually make a living, I have to bring pricing down to an equilibrium. And if there aren't a bunch of government regulations and taxes and burdens in place to drive up the cost even further, that allows me to bring the price down. And if I'm now allowed to say, hey, you know what, this person can afford to pay the full rate, so I'm going to pay them that. This person here, they can't afford to pay as much, so I'm going to charge them less. This person can't afford anything, so I can charge them more and write it off or whatever. I'd actually be allowed to do that if the federal government weren't banning me from doing so. Let's keep in mind, the concept of comprehensive health insurance only exists because of FDR's proposed wage caps during World War II and employers introducing things like comprehensive health insurance as an end run around those wage caps. That's the only reason we have it in the first place. That was not a market-derived thing. People didn't want that. People paid for healthcare if and when they needed it out of pocket. They may have like a catastrophic plan where they pay basically a nuisance fee every month, and if something terrible happens, now they're covered. But for the most part, in the same way that we don't have comprehensive car insurance where we pay thousands of dollars a month, but if something happens to our tires, it's taken care of, or they pay for our gas and our windshield wipers, we prefer to pay, an amount that covers liability in the case of an accident, and the rest of it we pay out of pocket. And that causes there to have to be some level of price equilibrium in order to be able to keep patients going, keep customers coming in. If you remove that, and if you make it where it's now a government mandated mechanism that is paying for something, a service that they themselves are not actually paying for because it's increasingly paid for out of the Federal Reserve and tax revenue, they just keep jacking up the prices because the end user isn't paying it until they pay their tax bill, until they have everything taken from them, until they end up seeing how inflation has stripped out all of their wealth because the Federal Reserve has pumped tens of trillions of new dollars into the economy and inflated the money supply and reduced the overall value of the dollars that we use every day. That's when we feel it. So the problem is that when you centralize power into a centralized authority, you are going to get harmful and inequitable outcomes. There are three ways for people to be able to interact with each other. Through cooperation, we work together. Through competition, we strive to provide the best value to someone so that I get the business instead of you. The other way is through coercion. I'm going to make you do something whether you or anyone else thinks it's a bad idea because I have the power to do so. Of those three, which do you think is the one that is going to lead to the worst outcomes?
Well, I think that it's a little more nuanced than that, but I understand the point that you're making. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about also, Spike, is you were very critical of the way that the government fiscal policy impacts the healthcare industry. But I wondered if you could talk about how under your proposals or with a limited government oversight in the healthcare industry, how will you navigate, like, I'm not a doctor. How would you regulate me from starting a business that says that I'm going to start surgery doing kidney removals?
Would you go to a kidney removal specialist who wasn't a doctor?
If I had $100 million and I could convince you that I was, I think it becomes a little bit of a different story.
Why would you be doing kidney removal if you had $100 million?
Maybe I have. I mean, history is full of people. Which the guy that won the Fields Medal, he was torturing people because he liked it in Puerto Rico. I just mean people have cryptic motives. I wonder how you could, without any sort of regulation in how medicine is administered, without any side of oversight in that capacity, how do you have a baseline for quality of care?
I think the baseline for quality of care, and first of all, we're not running against having baselines for quality of care on a government level. So again, we're not arguing for anarchy, but I would say this, I think— No,
I'm asking for mostly in your personal opinion, if you were to be able to structure the system, just so I can get a better idea, how do you envision oversight as far as, the actual practice of medicine completely removed from the fiscal element?
I recognize that when you look at the so-called oversight that's happening from the CDC and FDA, there are routinely abusive providers, and they are doing terrible things out in the open. And the way that the CDC, or rather the FDA and the federal government often respond, is to externalize the cost of their damage to the taxpayer and then indemnify them against lawsuits so that they can't have any kind of real repercussions against them, and they slap them on the wrist with some kind of fine that's a fraction of what the damage that they did. We see that in healthcare. We see that in the environment. We see that in pretty much anything that the government's protecting us on. Going back to actual, in terms of policy, the CDC, that was Centers for Disease Control, was created to, protect us in the case of, major health crises. For example, I don't know, a major highly viral pathogen coming across the shores and leading to a pandemic here. We saw what happened with COVID-19. For the first 6 to 8 weeks that it was here, the CDC said that medical professionals were not allowed to test or treat patients with COVID. When for the first nearly 2 months that it was here, when patients would come into their doctor's offices and say, "Doc, I'm not feeling too hot. I just got back from, Hubei province in China, and I'm not feeling good, and I'm seeing the news, and it says something about this coronavirus. I just want to get checked out." Those doctors had to say, "Sorry, there's nothing we can do for you," because it was against the law, because the government knew better, and they were busy creating test kits that ultimately ended up not working. So for 2 months, there was no testing, except for the case of a handful of people who broke the law, like Dr. Helen Chu at the University of Seattle, University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle, and some other doctors across the country who, when those patients came in, they thankfully put their Hippocratic oath above that stupid regulation, and they just started testing. They made the test kits, which apparently, if you know how to do such a thing, it's easy to do, unless you're the government. And then they made the test kits, and they tested patients, and some of them came back positive. They went to the CDC and said, "Listen, it's already here. We have to do something." The CDC, the people who are there to protect us from rapacious capitalism, told us that what their response to that was, destroy all the test results, tell no one that they have it, send them home, do nothing. A pathogen that doubles every 2 days, they said just send them on home. And now we know why it's so out of control here. That and the fact that the head of the government, that again is supposed to be protecting us, said that it was a hoax, that there's no real reason to wear a mask, that it's all just political to unseat him, and that, and he treated it very unseriously, because again, that's what you get from centralized authority. You get harmful outcomes because of their own personal benefit. You are concerned about powerful people running roughshod over us. So am I. That's why I want to decentralize.
Yeah, you don't have any disagreement for me that there was a horrible, there was just a horrible amount of flaws from the CDC and the government's federal response. Just to propose a slightly different scenario to you, and I don't want to play this game for long, but the example you gave was a man who goes to his doctor. He says, "I've recently been to, Wuhan, China, and I'm feeling like I have symptoms." That man can't give him a test. In a circumstance where we don't have a governing body that tells him that he can't do that, but he also doesn't have access to any tests. So I'm thinking something like an Elizabeth Holmes Theranos situation, where she says, "My device will test your blood." She gets it all the way. She takes it to Walgreens. She's selling this product. People believe that they're getting their blood read. They believe that they're being given good information that will impact their health and the decisions that they're making, and she's selling it and selling her service in a public square. How will you, stop a doctor from saying, "I have the real test for the coronavirus, and it's a hoax"?
We saw what happened there. She went out of business because when the due diligence was done, the test didn't work. That's the answer.
So you think those people should be subject to the exploitation until the due diligence is done?
The due diligence was done before it actually was put on market, because the people who were investing the money recognized that before they would put a brand new technology like that on the market, they needed to make sure it worked.
Sure.
So it's actually a perfect example of the market for the most part regulating itself. There was some state regulation involved, but that really didn't have to kick in. At the due diligence level, this is a perfect example. They went, "This doesn't work." And then and they had
after months of being in major chains throughout the country.
What's that?
After months of partnering with major health brands in the country, I just feel like there were people who were wronged in that situation.
Well, there were. My understanding is that there were some, it was like at the CVS Minute Clinics or something, they were using some of them. But that also, again, that was overseen by government, and it still happened. And the point I'm making is, I don't ever claim a utopia. And I think anyone who tries to claim it is foolish. What I am saying is that overall, generally speaking, when things are decentralized out, when you have more decision makers, when people have more power over their lives, which means they also have more wealth, they have more capital, they have more means, and they have more a communitarian basis to be able to work together voluntarily outside of some kind of centrally imposed, far away, arbitrarily defined and crony-friendly structure, we're going to generally have better outcomes. Is it going to stop every single fraud from being able to do something? No. And this current system isn't either. But what it's also not going to do is allow those frauds to get positions of power and impose themselves upon us when we even know that they're frauds, but it's the law. They're in charge. You got to go with it. There is at least a protection if you have it decentralized and you have it where it's not mandated. When you discover that fraud, they get rooted out. They can be sued. They can have their lives destroyed for doing that to people. But when you put them in a position where they can have themselves indemnified, we see this with environmental stuff. We see where major polluters, they do irreparable damage to the tune of trillions of dollars, and the EPA steps in and gives them a fine that's $100 million or something, a slap on the wrist if there even was one, and then they turn around and indemnify them against any kind of lawsuits from the people who were harmed, and they externalize the cost of the cleanup on us, the taxpayer, the victim of all that pollution. So this is what happens when you give more and more power to people. You are turning people into powerful people. You are turning people who are prone to corruption, all of us, into powerful people who are prone to corruption. And when you have that, you are going to have ever worsening outcomes. You are going to have people who are incentivized to lie and pander to you and pretend that they have your interest at heart, be lying to you right to your face, and immediately go into power and do the same thing that everyone else has been doing. We saw that with Trump. We saw that with Obama. We saw that with Bush. We see it every single time.
Well, you bring up climate change, and that's an interesting segue into another issue that we probably have a little bit of disagreement on, but that I wanted to just understand a little bit more your guys' platform on. Is the Libertarian ticket, what is your guys' stance on climate change, and what do you agree that perhaps the government, the centralized authority of the government, is in a unique position here? Not just our government, but world governments are in unique positions here to actually act and make a huge difference on climate change. It seems like something that the private sector is not doing anything to make better, and that the power solely rests in the hands of governments and these power.
The government isn't. I'm sorry. The government is in a unique position where they've largely created and allowed the problem to happen. And I shouldn't even say allowed. They have mandated that the problem happen. Again, when you allow massive amounts of pollution and you don't allow people to respond with lawsuits and you indemnify them against it, and then you use political tactics to turn the very science of climate change into a political argument to begin with, you poison you muddied the waters to be able to actually allow for any meaningful change to happen. Let's also keep in mind that the single largest polluter on the planet is the U.S. government. Bigger than any other polluter on earth is the U.S. government. And if you look at all of the other people who are also polluting, they are the cronies of the U.S. government. Here's something that it's actually affects quite a few things. We have a situation where in the last 30, 40 years, there has been an imposed effort to basically scorch the earth from an economic perspective in the U.S. to make it increasingly unaffordable to hire people in the U.S. or to do business or make things in the U.S. This was done by the very manufacturers who supposedly were being harmed by it. They did it intentionally, and the reason they did it was to stop their smaller competitors from being able to compete. They put these regulations and these taxes and these other barriers and burdens in place in order to basically make it nearly impossible to do business here, because they never intended to stay here. They intended to develop relationships with dictatorial governments like China and do sweatshop slave labor, sometimes prison labor, in other countries, and then import it back here. So going back to the environment, and we know all of the different harms that cause, but environmentally, you now have stuff being made in countries where there's no kind of environmental concern at all, and then shipped all the way back here in tankers, which exponentially increases the carbon footprint of every single thing that we buy and rent, that services and products that we need.
I'm totally on the same page as you. I just don't understand how, isn't that the problem of these? Isn't that outsourcing what these capitalist organizations want to do, regardless of what the government tells? I mean, wouldn't the government be more suited to demand these companies stay within our domestic borders and make your American hire American? You don't think that's part of the answer here?
No, the answer is to remove the barriers that made it unprofitable to do it here in the first place. So perfect example. Let's say we got two lemonade stands. The lemonade stand right in front of me is selling lemonade for 10 cents. The lemonade stand over there is selling lemonade for 15 cents or 20 cents. So I jack up the price of lemonade here to a dollar, so that now the lemonade over there, even though it costs money to ship it over here, makes it 25 cents or 30 cents, it's still much cheaper than the lemonade that I artificially, by my mandates, made more expensive here. So then I come to the rescue by jacking up the tariffs and making that a lemonade over there $1.10. And so now what have I done? I have profited on both sides. I have ordered everyone under my control, and I've harmed the consumer of lemonade, who used to be able to pay 10 cents, and now they're paying either $1 or $1.10. If I simply got out of the way and allowed the market to do what it does, they wouldn't have that problem in the first place. And that's the same thing that happened with the market here. But because of the expressed desire to make as many Americans as possible reliant on government and unable to be able to thrive on their own merit and be able to grow their own businesses or work for someone else here, because they've robbed them of that, in order the desire to do that then precipitated to them outsourcing. The outsourcing is the natural consequence of the barriers and burdens they put in place. Remove those barriers and burdens, and it would be unprofitable for them to outsource. It actually costs them more to outsource relative to just a deregulated economy here.
Don't you think they're outsourcing because of the lack of regulation they're finding in the countries they're outsourcing to? I mean, the reason Nike manufactures in China is because there are no regulations in China that prevent them from treating workers decently or paying them well.
Of course, but you're going to step B. Step A was make it unprofitable here, and step B was then go somewhere where it's still profitable because they knew their smaller competitors couldn't join them. They couldn't afford to do the outsourcing. They couldn't afford the hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars to move their base of operations or to set up, basically diplomatic relations with foreign companies. That's the point. You were correct. They went there because it's still profitable. But that's step B. Step A was make it unprofitable here. Deregulating the economy here makes it where it's not affordable to do it over there. It would be here, but that's not what they wanted.
What kind of
hold on, actually. Oh, I just had a question. Yeah, so let's imagine the same situation that the lemonade stand that you proposed, right? So instead of having the cheaper lemonade stand, that's still cheaper to transport the lemonade from over there back here. Mm-hmm. That all, like we said, rapidly accelerates the climate change. There's massive amounts of carbon emission transporting goods. It's actually one of the heaviest polluters is the transporting of goods that are made in China back to the United States. I think most people are familiar with that. Mm-hmm. But my question is, between those two people that are making the deal, like I'm the person that's buying the lemonade or I'm the person that's selling the lemonade. Those two people are in on the deal, right? But what about the externalities that are affected? So say that I'm not the person that's in on the deal. I'm just another person that lives nearby. I'm still being impacted by the carbon emissions that are taking place because of the actions of these other people. What if me and all of the other people who are not impacted by the sale of the lemonade, but are impacted by the emissions of the carbon, band together and say, we don't want people to be able to burn carbon? Is that something that you would support as a libertarian, or is that crossing the line in forming government?
Well, first of all, I think that if you remove the barriers that made it so that more carbon being burned in the first place, that deals with a lot of the problem before we even have to get into the next.
What if we were selling cars, something that emit just by their use?
No, I understand that. And that's the point I'm making is there's a lot we can do before we even get into the question that you're asking that greatly reduces and actually reduces the majority of the emission that's happening as a result.
Wait, like regulations, you mean? Or like what do you...
Getting rid of deregulating the economy here so that it's more profitable to do business here than it was,
But how can we get the carbon? How can we get the carbon out without regulations?
The regulations that are happening are actually causing them to go elsewhere. So what's happening is we keep hearing, well, the United States has actually seen a net reduction in their carbon emissions, and all the carbon emissions
because more of our stuff is getting permitted
in China. And yes, exactly, because it's exponentially growing in China. Exactly. So the problem is not being addressed, and so we see again where not only are regulations not reducing carbon emissions, actually leading to a net increase, and the cronies who put those regulations in place knew that that's what would happen and were perfectly fine with it because they don't give a crap about the environment. They wanted to be able to shut out their smaller competitors. They are using people who want to see regulations, which they are told will stop climate emissions, and instead they're using those, and what they always intended to do, to go somewhere else and to bring them back here and to screw over their smaller competitors and the American worker as a result. So going back to your question, the better way to deal with something is to allow someone to not be indemnified and allow them to be held liable in like a lawsuit or a class action for the damage that they're causing. It would not be hard to be able to say if company X is causing this amount of carbon emissions and is doing something that is unavoidable in terms of carbon emissions, because right now, unless we go to an all nuclear core, it's not effective for us to be able to continue to have the quality of life and the economy that we have without having some carbon emission. But if we're able to show people that are net much larger polluters as a result of that, in the same way that it's no different than an oil spill or leaking toxic chemicals or whatever into a river or a lake or something like that, you're leaking, basically toxins, carbon into the atmosphere. So I think that they should be able to be dealt with through lawsuits. I don't like the idea of regulations and cap and trade and all of that, because what ends up happening is the largest polluters are able to continue to basically pay a fee to pollute, and small people that can't afford that are basically told, yeah, no, you can't do anything because the cap has already been met. And so that leads to some incredibly inequitable outcomes. We're already seeing that where, they're basically forcing African countries not to be able to build power generation plants. So they're burning manure in order to be able to generate heat and energy, which is leading to all sorts of other health problems because they've already been capped. They can't do anymore. So cap and trade is a great way for wealthy people to continue to pollute, and the rest of us being told that, if we can't afford an electric car, we aren't going anywhere.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there that like on the consumer level, there's not really much we can do, as far
There's
as
not
getting
a lot,
electric
yeah.
cars.
There's not.
So just to pivot a little bit away from, the nitty gritty of libertarian policy and all that, I wanted to get your insight into the primary process of the libertarian nomination a little bit. Justin Amash, of course, excited and scared a lot of people when he teased a libertarian bid for the presidency earlier this year. And same with Jesse Ventura on the green side.
On the green side, yeah.
And it seemed like both of these candidates really had a lot of energy behind them until seemingly at the last moment when they decided not to run. And, of course they might have just been doing this is like a stunt, a profile boost. But I definitely found it a little bit weird that given how opportune this general election cycle could be for a third party candidate, given the pandemic and the horrible candidates we've been given in Biden and Trump. It seems like such a perfect election to run against the two party system. Do you think there's any, establishment forces putting pressure on potential candidates like Ventura or Amash, or even candidates like your running mate Jo Jorgensen to get out or to not really shake up the game too much?
I don't think so. I think we're still somewhere between the first they ignore you and then they laugh at you stages. I don't think we're at the then they fight you stage, because I don't think they realize what we're building. They don't realize that we're building something completely outside of their left-right rope-a-dope that they've been imposing for the last 160 plus years.
Yeah.
I think Jesse Ventura. I don't know as much about Jesse Ventura, why he chose not to run. With Justin Amash, knowing him, I was not surprised when he decided not to run. He was not going to get into the race unless it was pretty certain to him that he could win. That's just how he is. He's very, he gets all of his ducks in a row before deciding to do it. I was actually surprised that he took the step of creating an exploratory committee and participating in the debates. I think he may have, in retrospect, jumped the gun a little bit on that, because when I heard that he had dropped out, I was a little bit shocked, but then I really wasn't all that surprised, because he is someone that is somewhat risk averse when it comes to that kind of stuff. So I wasn't surprised that he ended up deciding, especially with COVID-19 and the pandemic and how it was going to be affecting things like ballot access and who was going to be coming out to vote and so forth. I think he just decided. I personally think he just decided not to run based on that, and he just declared he's not going to be running for re-election to Congress, which is disappointing. But with Jesse, I'm not sure so much. Is there pressure being put on by the establishment? Maybe, but honestly, I don't think it's that. I think that they feel secure enough right now that they're able to shut everyone else out of the process through the laws and the systems they've created, that they don't think that we're a real threat. And I think that they're about to be disabused.
Yeah, what's your strategy to overcome that? Do you guys have a real strategy to get on the debate stage, to get to that a certain percentage level?
Yeah, so in order to qualify for the debates, we have to get 15% or more in 5 reputable polls by I think just after Labor Day. And what we've seen is that, so in 2016, Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, our previous candidates, got 13% in one poll and 11% in 2 other polls. So they were pretty close to being able to qualify. What's happened since then? Everyone is that much more angry at government, on the left, on the right, on the center. We are all that much more upset about how things are going. And when we told them, listen, don't ever give us 2 terrible options like Trump and Hillary Clinton again, or you're not going to be happy, they went, okay, we'll give you Trump and someone who's kind of like Hillary Clinton, except he's been even worse in government and he sniffs children. And this is who they've given us as options. And so that's happened. And then the other thing that's happened is social media has that much more of a share of how people get media, and we are much more represented on social media than the dying TV mainstream news media, which tries to shut out non-Republicrats as much as possible. So I think that's more than enough to close that gap at 15%. And I think once we get Jo Jorgensen on the debate stage, and I think it's going to be a real emperor has new clothes moment. People are going to realize all this talk about, voting third party is a waste of a vote. And, if you vote for this one, you're just voting for Trump. Or if you're voting for this one, you're just voting for Biden, or whichever side you like less. You're just helping them.
Yeah, giving them the old Nader argument.
The old Nader argument. It was the old, when people talk about Bernie running third party, which we would have welcomed. They go, well, if you do that, then you're voting for Trump. Well, the degrees of difference between Biden and Trump, in my mind as a libertarian, are not nearly enough for me to be able to say that one is better than the other, especially when Joe Biden, as terrible as Donald Trump is, remember, Joe Biden is the architect of the
1994
militarized
crime
police
bill.
state. He's
Yep.
the crime bill. This is a man who 10 years after segregation ended said that he didn't like integration because he didn't want his children to live in a racial jungle. I mean, this is a uniquely
gussying
bad
up with his
candidate.
good friend Strom Thurmond. Yeah.
Yeah, and his good friend Strom Thurmond and all the other segregationists that he worked with to try to end busing. Like, I mean, this is a uniquely bad man for them to pick for especially in this climate. Now, thankfully, because of what's going on, he's probably going to pick Kamala Harris as his running mate. One of the most brutal prosecutors in recent memory.
Top cop in the most populous state in the country. What a great response to the protest movement.
Exactly. A woman who actually illegally withheld exculpatory evidence in a capital murder case. She knew the guy didn't do it and was trying to refuse to release the evidence that she knew would stop him from getting executed. That, in my mind, is attempted murder. So given all of these things, I think that with Jo Jorgensen in between these two men, who can barely form a coherent sentence between the two of them, and more importantly are emblematic of everything that is wrong with this government and the political culture and the cynical joke that the Republicrats have made of politics. And you contrast that with a self-made entrepreneur and someone who's able to break down case by case and point by point exactly how they've caused these problems and how her common sense libertarian solutions are the way out of those problems. I think it's over. I think we win that.
I just had a question for you more personally. You've had a really, unique approach to, spreading your ideas, I'll say. We're having Vermin Supreme on to talk on Sunday. You're familiar with him and his campaign ran together. I just wondered if you could talk about, obviously, there's a lot of parody and satire in your efforts together, but I just wondered, one, if you could tell us, like, how did you meet Vermin Supreme and how did you guys come to connect? And also, what's the response that you've gotten when you use that as a means of, breaking the ice with voters?
So these are great questions. I met Vermin Supreme. He was actually on my show last September, and we had a great time. It was an awesome show. We had a ton of fun. He then invited me to come out to I live in South Carolina, and the South Carolina convention, Libertarian Party convention, was last November, and it was in Florence, which is about an hour from where I live. And he invited me to come and join him at his Airbnb and hang out with him, me and my co-host, Matt. And we had a great time with him then, spent time with him at the convention. And then about 2 weeks later, he and his team reached out to me and asked me to be his proposed running mate during the for lack of a better word, primary process. And the way it works, our system works differently. We don't pick a president who then chooses their running mate. We pick who we want to be our presidential nominee. And then the next day we pick who we want to be our vice presidential nominee. So they're two uniquely different things. But Vermin Supreme has found an incredible way to use satire and humor to reach people who are so disgusted by this process that they don't want to hear anything from a politician. They're so disgusted with all of this. And so, but they'll listen to him because he's entertaining them and he's funny and he's making fun of the people that they hate. And he's making the reporters who have made this into such a cynical joke, make them look foolish, put the joke on them, make them the punchline for once, and they eat it up. They love it. They don't feel like they're being pandered to by a politician, so their cognitive defenses go down. They're being entertained. They're enjoying every bit of it. And over time, they start to think, what's the underlying message here? What is it that this guy really thinks? And then that's when we're able to hit them with the actual message of libertarianism. So I'm very grateful for everything that Vermin has done to bring people into the libertarian movement, into the Libertarian Party. And we're grateful for everything he's doing to promote this campaign. Jo and I are running to end that cynical joke and to put the power back in the people's hands, that they're not being treated as the punchline of powerful people who want to keep them in a bad situation for their benefit.
That's super interesting. I just was wondering, do you think he's at all pissed that he didn't get to be the vice president?
Oh, vice president? No, I think. Let me phrase it this way. So he made it to the final round, but Jo Jorgensen ended up winning. The next day, I won the nomination.
Okay.
Seconds later, I get a phone call from Vermin Supreme offering his condolences. So, and just in that, it was like, well, this continue, it's over for me. I get to go and enjoy my summer. You have to now go and run for vice president.
Be vice president. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't. I think he's enjoying his summer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you guys do get on the debate stage, I think it would be super cool if you're able to debate, Mike Pence and Kamala Harris or, whoever it may be. That would definitely be a change of dynamic. I think that your average American wouldn't necessarily know what to make of it first, I believe. I think it would definitely be a shock to the system. And just I'm sure you would have some tricks up your sleeve where you'd actually get up on the stage, ways to, definitely make some noise. So I think that could be a really interesting change in this election that I don't think a lot of people are talking about right now. But I think you're right. People are sick of the government. And I don't necessarily agree with you that they would want less government right now, but I do think that they would agree that a third party, a neutral, someone that's not from one of the two established parties could definitely break through in this moment. And, here at the Vanguard, we're huge fans of third parties. So we definitely think what you're doing is cool in that sense.
Well, thank you, and that means a lot.
And if people are curious about your guys' platform, they want to learn more, where can they go?
Absolutely. So you can go to Jo20, that's JO20.com. If you want to find out more, there's stuff there. You can also follow me on my social media. I'm at Real Spike Cohen on Twitter. On Facebook, I'm just Spike Cohen. If you type in Spike Cohen, you'll find me. I am literally Spike Cohen on Instagram and TikTok for the kids. If you want me on TikTok, and I am Spike Cohen on YouTube as well. And if you're interested in what we're doing and want to join us in our vision to set America free, I welcome you to go to jo20.com. We have a volunteer form. If you're able to make a contribution, we would greatly appreciate any donation you can make as well. And I appreciate this opportunity to talk with the two.
It was really fun.
Yeah, man, we really appreciate you coming on. Obviously we don't see everything eye to eye, but it's great to have Vanguard voices, people who are ready to shake the boat from the outside and actually, chat.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity. I'm fine with us not agreeing on everything. We agree on the fact that this system is a mess and needs to be changed from the ground up. What it looks like, honestly, we can figure that out as we get there, but we need to dismantle what we have and start working towards something that is fairer and equitable. And we need to look at the mechanisms of how to do that.
And it's not the Democrats or Republicans that are going to get us out of this situation.
Exactly. It is not the Democrats. It is not the Republicrats who are going to fix their own system that they intentionally imposed upon us to harm us.
Agreed.
Well, thanks, Spike. We really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, guys. Have a great rest of your evening, and I look forward to seeing you again, hopefully.